This is a video I promised to make for someone years ago. Something like 6 or 7 years back, a viewer and I got into a discussion about cognates, and I told him I'd make a whole video about them. And then I forgot. Sorry. But recently I remembered, and I'm really glad I did, because cognates are fascinating and they deserve a deep dive. So today we're finally going to talk about them. Cognates are one of the most interesting and potentially deceptive aspects of language learning. At first glance, they seem like an easy shortcut. Words that look and sound familiar between languages, making at least a subset of Spanish vocabulary feel instantly accessible to English speakers. But as a student of translation and interpretation, I learned early on that cognates are not to be trusted blindly. I was taught to be skeptical of them, to never assume a word meant what I thought it did just because it looked familiar. A single misused or misinterpreted word can ruin a translation. That's why I take a different approach to cognates than many Spanish teachers and students. I see them as a fascinating look into the historical connections between languages, but also as a potential minefield, one that needs to be navigated carefully. So what exactly are cognates? Cognates are words in two different languages that share a common origin from an earlier language. Sometimes they look alike. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they still have similar meanings today, and other times their meanings have drifted apart. But none of that changes whether they are true cognates. What defines a cognate pair is its ancestry. If two words trace back to the same historical root, then they are cognates, regardless of whether they look identical or are barely recognizable as related. English and Spanish share many deep-level cognates that trace back to Proto-Indo-European. But over thousands of years, these words have changed so much in structure and meaning that they're often unrecognizable as related. These words are cognates, but we don't usually talk about them that way because they've evolved so much that we can't easily see the connection between them. There are other words that English and Spanish have in common, though, words that English adopted much more recently. These words didn't come from ancient Proto-Indo-European roots or from the deep Germanic heritage of English. Instead, they entered English through Latin, either indirectly via French or as direct borrowings from Latin itself. The Norman conquest of England in 1066 was a major turning point for the English language. The Normans, originally Norsemen who'd settled in France, had adopted elements of the culture, customs, and institutions of the French, as well as the French language. As the conquerors of England, they infused the English language with thousands of Latin-based French words, especially in law, government, the military, and high culture, areas they dominated. In addition, because Latin was the language of law, education, and religion throughout medieval Europe, scholars, clergy, and legal officials in England used it for centuries. As a result, English absorbed many Latin words. These Latin borrowings, along with the thousands that came through French, are why English and Spanish share tons of vocabulary words, even though one language is Germanic and the other is Romance. I believe it's estimated that English and Spanish share around 20,000 of these more recently acquired cognates, and it's these words that people are normally referring to when they speak of English-Spanish cognates. One convention that second language teachers have introduced is the contrast between true cognates, near cognates, and false cognates. This classification comes from a fundamental misunderstanding of what a cognate is. What they mean by this is words that look alike and mean the same thing, words that look alike and sometimes mean the same thing, and words that look alike but don't mean the same thing. But the way second language teachers classify cognates doesn't have anything to do with the linguistic definition of cognate. In linguistic terms, cognates are simply words in different languages that share a common origin. Whether they still mean the same thing today is irrelevant. A pair of words is either cognates or they're not. They either descend from the same ancestral word or they don't. I think more accurate labels for how closely meanings align would be true friends, occasional friends, and false friends. Terms that acknowledge differences in meaning, without implying that a word pair stops being cognates if their meanings don't align sufficiently. But even then, meaning doesn't fall neatly into three categories. Instead, it exists on a spectrum. Cognates rarely have perfect overlap in meaning, and they rarely have zero overlap either. Most fall somewhere in between, meaning similar things some of the time and having different meanings some of the time. So trying to force them into rigid categories like true, near, and false is too simplistic. Virtually 100% of discussion about cognates within second language learning repeats this inaccurate and overly simplified model, insisting that words are true cognates if they mean the same thing and false cognates if they don't. No. Words are cognates if they descend from a common ancestral word. That's it. Alright, so now we know what cognates are. Now I've met second language teachers who, when teaching about cognates, seem to suggest that because there are thousands of English-Spanish cognates, Spanish students somehow start out with a built-in vocabulary of thousands of words. But that's not how language works. Just because an English-Spanish cognate pair exists doesn't mean you automatically know it or can use it correctly. Cognates might give learners a head start in recognizing some vocabulary, but they don't magically grant fluency. Let's talk about this concept a bit. First, the fact that cognates exist doesn't mean you automatically know them or that they're part of your usable vocabulary. If I informed you that English and Spanish share thousands of cognates and then said, "Go, use that fact to speak Spanish," how exactly would that help you? What would you do with that information? Simply knowing that cognates exist doesn't mean that you can summon them at will. You might attempt to make educated guesses about Spanish words, assuming they have direct cognates in English, but what are the chances you'd guess correctly? Most of the time, the cognate you imagine wouldn't exist at all. You might think of an English word that feels like it should have a Spanish equivalent, but it just doesn't. For example, bravery seems like it ought to have the Spanish cognate bravería, but that's not a word. The actual translation is valentía. Likewise, you might assume that burden becomes burdena, also not a word. The real Spanish word is carga. And murder, it might seem like it should be murdero, but the correct translation is asesinato, and so on. While it's true that there are lots of English-Spanish cognates, the number of cases where words aren't cognates is infinitely larger, and you have no way whatsoever of knowing when to expect a cognate. There are also many cases where cognates exist, but their forms don't fully align. For example, the English word pressure has the Spanish cognate presión, but if you were to guess, you might assume the Spanish word would be presura. Similarly, permission in English corresponds to permiso in Spanish, though an English speaker might mistakenly guess permisión. Another example is motion, which translates to movimiento in Spanish. While movimiento is a cognate of movement, a synonym of motion, an English speaker might expect moción instead. So again, while it's true that there are many English-Spanish cognates that are close in structure, there is a very large number that are so different that you'd never just guess what they are. Second, even if you guess that the Spanish equivalent is a cognate, and even if the form is similar, it's different enough that you'd say it wrong. For example, if you knew that the Spanish cognate of object is objeto, you might assume that project would be projeto. Similarly, knowing that contract translates as contrato might lead you to guess that contact would be contacto. And if fraction corresponds to fracción, you might expect function to be función. But project is proyecto, contact is contacto, and function is función, without the double C. I had a professor in my grad program who spoke otherwise outstanding Spanish, but who used to pronounce función like función, and it drove me crazy. The point is that even cognate pairs that are similarly structured may differ in important ways, and you often can't predict those differences, even if you've learned other, seemingly parallel cognates. And third, because cognates rarely have perfect overlap in meaning, you're likely to misuse or misunderstand cognates you haven't studied. And this is the point they pounded into our heads when I was a translation student. For example, the English word education has the Spanish cognate educación. In many contexts, this cognate pair share the same meaning, but in Spanish, educación can also refer to good manners or upbringing, a nuance that doesn't exist in English. Similarly, career and carrera are cognates, but in Spanish, carrera can also mean a university degree or even a race, like a foot race or a car race. And this pattern applies to so many common cognate pairs. They often have very different meanings depending on the context. In fact, there tends to be a correlation between how frequently a cognate appears in speech or writing and how much its meaning has diverged between English and Spanish. Words that are commonly used in both languages are more likely to have developed additional or different meanings over time, increasing the chances of misunderstanding. This is because frequent usage exposes words to a wider range of contexts, allowing meanings to shift and expand independently in each language. So the cognates that have been the most common in everyday speech and writing over time are the ones you need to study most carefully. Even well-educated bilinguals, including Spanish professors and professional translators, frequently use them incorrectly. One interesting example I recall comes from a study on the use of voceo in Cali, Colombia. The authors reported that native Spanish speakers in Cali described voceo as a sign of confianza, which they took to mean that people used voceo when they feel particularly confident or when speaking to someone who exudes confidence. And embarrassingly, that's how they described it in their study. But that's not what their Caleño informants meant. The Spanish word confianza only partially overlaps with the English word confidence. In Spanish, confianza also translates as trust, familiarity, closeness, and intimacy. What the participants in the study were actually saying was that in Cali, voceo is used between people who know each other well and have a close personal connection, such as close friends and family. And I could give countless, innumerable similar examples of misuse or misunderstanding of cognates. There aren't just three categories, true, close, and false. The fact is that alignment in both form and meaning fall on a continuum, with a majority of the most common and useful cognates having only partial agreement. Now, despite everything I've said about the dangers of relying on cognates, I can completely understand why some students and teachers are enthusiastic about them. To be fair, cognates do offer some advantages if they're approached the right way. Cognates can make language learning feel less overwhelming. For beginners, learning a new language can feel like drinking from a fire hose. There's so much to absorb, new sounds, new grammar, new vocabulary, and it's easy to feel like you're drowning. But when students realize that thousands of words in Spanish already look familiar, it gives them an immediate confidence boost. Cognates help with reading comprehension. Even if you can't just predict cognates when speaking or writing, they can be useful in reading comprehension. If you're scanning a news article or trying to get the gist of a paragraph, recognizing familiar-looking words can help you decipher meaning, even if the cognate words don't have perfect overlap. Cognates can speed up vocabulary acquisition. Cognates may not be a free pass to fluency, but they do make some vocabulary easier to remember. Words that look and sound familiar require less effort to commit to memory than completely unrelated words. It's easier for an English speaker to remember that famoso means famous than to memorize that ajeno means foreign. That recognition helps students build their passive vocabulary faster, which can in turn help them understand more Spanish in context. Cognates reveal useful patterns in word formation. Once students start to notice predictable patterns between English and Spanish cognates, they can use that knowledge to make educated guesses about unfamiliar words. For example, English words ending in tion often become cion in Spanish. Nation, nación, action, acción, education, educación, and so forth. English ity often corresponds to Spanish idad. Activity, actividad, university, universidad, and so on. English ous frequently turns into oso, curious, curioso, generous, generoso, and the like. By learning these patterns, students can recognize words more easily when they appear in conversation or text. Studying differences in meaning can be a source of improved accuracy. Ironically, while cognates are often a source of errors, they can also be an excellent way to improve precision. Knowing that most cognate pairs don't have identical meanings, you can study them, learning all about their differences. By paying attention to those differences, learners can sharpen their understanding of both languages and avoid embarrassing mistakes. As a former translator, I have a different approach to cognates than many Spanish teachers and students. In my undergraduate program, I was taught to be extremely suspicious of cognates, to never assume a word meant what I thought it did just because it looked familiar. Instead, I was trained to research and document a word's meanings in all of its various contexts before using it. In translation, the stakes are high. Misinterpreting or misusing a word can ruin a translation. So I learned early on that cognates are not a shortcut, but rather a potential minefield that must be navigated carefully. That said, I do find cognates to be a fascinating category of words. For students, discovering a cognate can be satisfying. It feels like unlocking a hidden door in language where a familiar word suddenly gives you access to meaning. Cognates can provide a sense of progress, a boost of confidence, and even a deeper appreciation for the way languages evolve and influence each other. but using them well requires study and wisdom. All right, that's my discussion of cognates. If you have any thoughts, please write something in the comments. I try to read every reply to every video. If you enjoyed this discussion or learned something from it, please give this video a like and subscribe to this channel so you don't miss future content.